My name is Violet Kessler. I am 42 years old. The piano was gone when I got to my grandmother's house. I want to start there because that specific absence is what everything else in this story flows from. And I want you to understand the particular quality of that absence before I explain anything else. My grandmother's name was Helen Adele Kessler. She died on a Tuesday in November 4 years ago, at the age of 87, in the house on Birch Street in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had lived since 1961. The house was a Victorian-era structure that my grandfather had bought on the year they married, and that my grandmother had occupied and maintained and slowly, deliberately filled with the specific accumulated presence of a long life lived deliberately in one place. The piano had been in the front parlor of that house since 1952. A Steinway upright, Model K52, with a warm walnut case and ivory keys that had yellowed in the specific way of ivory piano keys from that era, and that had, as a result, the particular golden cast and afternoon light that new white keys do not have and cannot replicate. My grandmother had bought it used from a music school that was closing in Cincinnati's Clifton neighborhood, and she had paid, by the accounting she had described to me many times, because I had asked many times, more than she could comfortably afford in 1952, which was one of the specific details that told me how much the piano had mattered to her from the beginning. She had been playing since she was 7 years old. She played until she was 84, when the arthritis in her hands made it impossible to continue with anything like the fluency she required of herself, the specific demanding standard of someone who had played seriously for 77 years, and who preferred not to play at all to playing badly. Even after the playing stopped, she sat at the piano regularly. I understood, having watched her do it from childhood, that the sitting was not performance and was not nostalgia. It was simply the continuation of a relationship between a person and an object that had been one of the central relationships of her life. I arrived at the house on Birch Street on the morning of the funeral, 2 hours before the service, having driven from Columbus where I live and work. My grandmother's death had not been a surprise in the specific way that deaths of 87-year-olds are rarely surprises, though they are also never easy. I had been present in Birch Street often in the final 2 years, every other weekend, doing the specific tasks of a granddaughter whose grandmother is still herself but not as able as she was, driving to appointments and managing the maintenance issues that a Victorian house accumulates, and making the Sunday dinners that my grandmother had made every Sunday for 60 years, and that I was learning to make from watching her make them. I walked into the front parlor first. I always walked into the front parlor first. The front parlor was where the piano was. The piano was not there. The space where it had stood since 1952 was an area of undisturbed dust in the shape of the piano's footprint, the specific outline of an object that has occupied the same position for 72 years and has not been moved in all that time. Around the dust outline, the parlor floor was the specific color of old hardwood that has been walked on for decades. Inside the outline, it was darker, protected from the light and the foot traffic, the original color preserved. I stood in the front parlor of my grandmother's house and looked at the dust outline of the Steinway upright Model K52. And I felt something I want to describe precisely because precision serves it better than paraphrase. I felt the specific sensation of an absence that was not merely the absence of an object, but the absence of the object's entire history, the 72 years of it in that room, the specific weight of what it represented to my grandmother and to me, and to the relationship between us that had been built around it. Then I felt anger, because someone had removed it, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived almost immediately, who had removed it. My uncle's name is Daniel Kessler. He is my father's younger brother. He is 63 years old, and he is the specific kind of person who, in situations involving family property and family decisions, tends to act before anyone else has been told what is happening. I found Daniel in the kitchen, standing beside the coffee maker with the specific quality of someone who is waiting for confrontation they have anticipated and have decided to meet with a particular posture. He saw me come in from the hallway. He said, "Before you say anything, I had a right to it." I said, "Where is the piano?" He said, "I sold it." I said, "When?" He said, "Yesterday, the day before the funeral." While I was in Columbus preparing to drive to Cincinnati, my uncle had sold my grandmother's piano. He said, "It's worth money, Violet. It's a Steinway. Someone from Craigslist paid $8,000 for it. That money goes into the estate and gets distributed properly." I said, "My grandmother wanted me to have that piano." He said, "Do you have that in writing?" I looked at my uncle across my grandmother's kitchen, in the house where I had spent every other weekend for 2 years, in the house where the piano had been since 1952, where I had first learned to play when I was 6 years old. I said, "You know she wanted me to have it." He said, "I know you believe that. I also know she didn't put it in her will, which means it's part of the estate, which means it gets distributed according to what the will says and not according to what anyone remembers her saying." He said this with the specific, confident authority of someone who has done a thing they know was questionable and who has prepared the specific justification for why it was not questionable. The will divided my grandmother's estate among her 3 surviving children, my father and his 2 siblings, Daniel and my Aunt Margaret. The personal property, the furniture and the household items and the objects she had collected and tended across 87 years was to be divided by agreement among the 3 siblings, or, failing agreement, by auction. The piano was personal property. The piano had not been specifically bequeathed. Daniel was right about this in the narrow technical sense of being right about the specific words in the specific will. He was wrong about everything else, including, it turned out, the facts. I want to tell you about Elena Markova before I tell you about the funeral, because understanding who Elena Markova is and what she meant in the context of what happened is necessary to understanding what happened. Elena Markova had been a piano teacher in Cincinnati for 41 years at the time of my grandmother's funeral. She was originally from Ukraine, having come to the United States in 1979, and she had been teaching piano in the Clifton neighborhood of Cincinnati from 1981 onward, first from a studio in her apartment, and eventually in a dedicated teaching space she rented in the neighborhood. She had been my piano teacher from the time I was 6 years old until I left for college at 18. 12 years of weekly lessons every Tuesday afternoon at 3:30 in the teaching space on McMillan Avenue that smelled specifically of rosin and old sheet music, and the particular warm, sweet smell of a room where someone had been playing piano for hours before I arrived. She had also been my grandmother's piano teacher, not recently, long before I was born. Elena had begun teaching my grandmother in 1982, when she was in her early 50s, returning to piano study after a long gap, working through the specific pleasure of an accomplished adult learner who wanted to develop more formal technique than a lifetime of self-taught playing had given her. The lessons had continued for 11 years, until my grandmother's hands began the early stages of the arthritis that would eventually make playing impossible. Elena and my grandmother had maintained a friendship beyond the professional relationship, the specific friendship of 2 women who had spent 11 years discussing music and life in the way that piano lessons allow, an intimacy that the weekly rhythm of the teaching relationship produces and that sometimes survives the end of the lessons and becomes its own thing. They had lunch every month for 30 years. Elena had been to the house on Birch Street many times. Elena had played the Steinway upright in the front parlor. She had been present when I began my lessons at 6, and she had watched, across 12 years of my Tuesday afternoons, what the piano and my grandmother's relationship to it meant. She came to the funeral. She was in the 3rd row when I walked in. She had known my grandmother for 42 years, and she came to pay her respects in the specific way of someone who has lost a genuine friend rather than an acquaintance. I saw her when I took my seat. I had not known she would be there. We made the specific eye contact of 2 people who share a history and who are both in the same grief and who will speak after the service. After the service, standing in the foyer of the church while people offered condolences, Elena came to find me. She said, "Violet, I'm so sorry. She was a remarkable woman." I said, "She was. I'm so glad you came." She said, "I have to ask you something before I leave. I drove by Birch Street this morning before the service. I wanted to see the house, and I noticed—" She paused. "The piano. It wasn't visible through the parlor window." "Is it being moved somewhere?" I said. "My uncle sold it yesterday." Elena was quiet. She said, "He sold it." I said, "Yes, for $8,000. He said it was personal property and part of the estate." Elena said, "Did he know about the note?" I said, "What note?" She drove me to Birch Street after the service. My uncle and my aunt and my father were at the house already, the specific gathering of family after a funeral that requires the house to be occupied by the people who have just buried the person who owned it. I walked through the front door behind Elena, and I took her directly to the parlor and the dust outline of the piano, and I said, "What note?" She said, "Helen told me about it last spring. She said she had written a note and put it inside the piano, taped to the inside of the lid," she said, "because she wanted it to stay with the piano. She said she had written who the piano was supposed to go to and why." I said, "She put a note inside the piano." She said she was worried that Daniel would try to take it. She said she didn't want to change the will again because she had already changed it twice, and she was tired of the attorney, and she thought if she wrote down her wishes clearly and kept the note with the piano, that would be enough. I said, "The piano is gone." She said, "I know, but the note is with the piano." I stood in the parlor of my grandmother's house and looked at the dust outline and thought about a note taped to the inside of the lid of a Steinway upright that was currently in someone's house, purchased from Craigslist for $8,000 by a buyer whose name my uncle knew. I went to find Daniel. He was in the kitchen, same position as the morning, beside the coffee maker. He had the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for the conversation that was coming since the moment I walked into the house that morning. Elena was with me. He looked at her and understood, from the specific quality of the looking, that something had changed in the situation. I said, "Daniel, there was a note inside the piano, taped to the inside of the lid. Did you see it when you sold it?" He looked at me, then at Elena, then back at me. He said, "What note?" I said, "Grandma wrote her wishes down and kept them inside the piano. She told Elena about it last spring. She wrote who the piano was supposed to go to." His expression did the specific thing that expressions do when someone encounters information they had not anticipated and is running the implications of that information against the position they have established. He said, "Even if there was a note isn't a legal document." I said, "No, but it's Grandma's own handwriting describing her wishes, and given that it was kept with the object it addressed, it's going to be pretty relevant if this becomes a dispute. And the buyer has the piano, which means the buyer has the note." He said, "The buyer paid $8,000 for a piano. He's not going to give it back." I said, "He might, if what he purchased was not the seller's to sell, and he can be made whole some other way." He said, "You don't know what the note says." I said, "No, but Elena knows what Grandma told her it said, and Elena is willing to confirm that in writing." Elena said quietly, in the specific, direct way of a woman who has been teaching music for 41 years and who understands that certain moments require her to speak, "I am willing to confirm exactly what Helen told me, that she had written her wishes regarding the piano, that she had specifically named the recipient, and that she named Violet." The kitchen was quiet. My uncle looked at the space where my grandmother's coffee maker had stood for 30 years. He looked at the floor. He looked at something I could not identify in the middle distance above the kitchen table. He said, "I knew she wanted you to have it." I said, "I know you knew." He said, "It wasn't in the will." I said, "I know, He said, "I thought if it wasn't in the will, it was fair game." I said, "Daniel." He said, "I know. I know what I did." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have the buyer's name and number. Let me stop here, because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been in the specific position of having the proof you needed and discovering that the proof arrived through a person who happened to be sitting in the third row of a church and who knew something that changed the shape of everything?" Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what happened next is not what most people in my position would have done, and I want you to understand the full context before I tell you what I chose. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. My uncle gave me the buyer's name, Marcus Webb, a man in Hyde Park who had been looking for an upright Steinway for his daughter, who was 12 years old and studying piano. I want to tell you what I did and did not do, because both matter. I called Marcus Webb the following day. I told him who I was and what the piano was, and that it had been sold under circumstances that were more complicated than a standard private sale. I was specific about the circumstances because I believed he deserved the full information. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Is there a note inside the piano?" I said, "I believe so. I haven't seen it. I don't know for certain." He said, "I found something inside the lid when I was cleaning the piano this morning. A folded piece of paper, taped there. I didn't read it because it wasn't addressed to me." I said, "Did it have a name on the outside?" He said, "It said for whoever plays this piano after me." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "May I come see it?" He said, "Yes." I drove to Hyde Park the following afternoon. Marcus Webb was a man in his mid-40s with the specific quality of someone who understands that he has become part of something he did not ask to be part of, and who is handling that with genuine decency. His daughter was at school. The piano was in their living room. It was beautiful. I had not seen it in the specific way of someone seeing something they have known their whole life from the outside. It had always been in my grandmother's parlor. Seeing it in a different room was the specific, uncanny quality of a familiar object in an unfamiliar context. Marcus left me alone with the piano. I opened the lid. Inside, taped to the wooden surface, was a folded piece of paper in an envelope on which my grandmother had written in her specific handwriting. The handwriting that had labeled my birthday cards and grocery lists and recipe cards across 42 years. The words, "For whoever plays this piano after me." I took the note carefully. I sat down at the piano bench. I opened the envelope. My grandmother's note was 3 paragraphs on a piece of white paper, written in the specific, deliberate handwriting of a woman who understood that the words she was writing mattered, and who was writing them with the care they deserved. She wrote that the piano had been hers since 1952, and that she had played it for 72 years, and that it was the thing she loved most of the things she owned, more than the furniture and more than the jewelry, and more than the art on the walls. She wrote that she wanted the piano to go to Violet, who had learned to play on it, and who had kept playing and who understood what it was and what it meant, and who would take care of it the way it deserved to be taken care of. She wrote in the final paragraph, something I want to reproduce because it is hers and it belongs to this story. If you are reading this and you are not Violet, please know that the piano is meant for someone specific, and I hope you will find a way to honor that. If you are reading this and you are Violet, I hope you know that I left it here for you because the piano needed to go with the person who knows its whole story. That is you. It has always been you. I sat at my grandmother's piano in Marcus Webb's living room, and I read her note, and I held the specific weight of it in the specific way of receiving something from someone who is no longer there to hand it to you. Marcus came back in when he heard me stop moving. He said, "Is that the note?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What does it say?" I said, "It says she wanted me to have the piano." He looked at me, then at the piano, then back at me. He said, "I paid $8,000 for it." I said, "I know." He said, "My daughter has been playing it for 2 days. She loves it." I said, "I know." He said, "What do you want to do?" I sat at the piano bench in Marcus Webb's living room, and I thought about my grandmother's note, and about the dust outline on the floor of the front parlor, and about Elena Markova in the 3rd row of the church, and about what my grandmother had been trying to protect when she wrote the note and taped it inside the lid. She had been trying to protect the piano's future. She had wanted it to go to someone who knew its whole story, who would care for it the way it deserved. I looked at Marcus. I said, "May I play it?" He said, "Of course." I played it for 20 minutes. The Steinway upright model K52 with the yellowed ivory keys and the warm walnut case and the specific warm tone that a well-maintained Steinway develops over 70 years of regular playing. It was exactly as I remembered it. The middle C slightly bright the way it had always been. The upper register clear and the lower register full. I played the Chopin nocturne my grandmother had loved most, the specific one she had played at the end of lessons when she was teaching me, the one she said told you everything you needed to know about what music was for. When I stopped, Marcus's daughter was standing in the doorway. She had come home from school while I was playing. She was 12 years old, with her father's specific quality of someone who was paying close attention without calling attention to the paying. She said, "That was beautiful." I said, "Thank you." "This piano has been in my family since 1952. She said, "I know. Dad told me." I said, "Do you know the Chopin I played?" She said, "Yes. I'm learning Nocturne in E-flat." I said, "That's the one." She said, "Were you sad when you played it?" I looked at this 12-year-old girl who had been playing my grandmother's piano for 2 days and who had learned the same nocturne I had learned at 12 and who had the specific quality of someone paying close attention. I said, "Yes." I was sad, but the piano made it easier. She said, "That's what pianos are for, my teacher says." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Your teacher is right." I turned to Marcus. I said, "I want to make you a proposal." The proposal I made Marcus Webb was this. I said, the piano was not my uncle's to sell. Legally, the situation is complicated. There was no specific bequest in the will, which means he could argue he was administering the estate. My grandmother's note is not a legal document. I said, I don't want to pursue a legal resolution. I want a different one. Marcus said, "What kind?" I said, "I want your daughter to have the piano. Not because I'm giving it up or giving you something you're not entitled to. Because your daughter is 12 and she is learning the Chopin nocturne on a Steinway that my grandmother played for 72 years, and my grandmother's note says she wanted it to go to someone who would take care of it the way it deserved." I said, "I think your daughter qualifies." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You could get the piano back. If you push the legal issue?" I said, "Possibly." But I'm not sure that's what my grandmother meant by honoring her wishes. He said, "What did she mean?" I said, "She meant the piano should go to someone who knows its whole story. I know the whole story. I was there for most of it. What I want is for the story to continue, and I think it continues better with a 12-year-old who is learning the Chopin nocturne than it does being moved again." He said, "What do you want from me?" I said, 3 things. I said, "The note. I want the note, the original, because it is my grandmother's handwriting and it belongs with me even if the piano doesn't." I said, "The $8,000 my uncle took from the estate as the sale price needs to be returned to the estate because the sale wasn't proper and the money shouldn't have gone in. Your daughter should keep the piano and the estate should be made whole separately." I said, and I want to come and hear your daughter play the Chopin Nocturne when she finishes learning it." Marcus said, "That's a very specific request." I said, "The Nocturne is specific." He said, "I'll talk to my daughter." He came back in 10 minutes. She had said yes to all three. She had also, apparently, said that she wanted to know the piano's name, which was something she had told Marcus she did the first day. Marcus said, "She names everything." "Does the piano have a name?" I thought about this. I said, "My grandmother called it the Baldwin, even though it's a Steinway." She could never remember which one she had bought, and it stuck. He said, "The Baldwin." I said, "The Baldwin." He said, "She'll be pleased." I went to Daniel the following week, not to confront him in any dramatic way, to settle the account, specifically and without theater. I told him about the note. I told him what it said. I showed him a photograph I had taken of it before giving the original to Marcus's daughter, who had asked if she could keep it with the piano's other documents. Daniel read the note in the photograph. He said, "She wrote this." I said, "Yes." He said, "She was afraid I would take it." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I knew she wanted you to have it. I knew that. I sold it anyway because it wasn't in the will, and I told myself that made it legitimate." I said, "I know." He said, "The $8,000. I said, "Goes back into the estate. The buyer is keeping the piano." He said, "You didn't fight to get it back." I said, "No." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because there's a 12-year-old girl learning the Chopin Nocturne on it, and my grandmother wanted it to go to someone who would take care of it the way it deserved, and I think she is that person." He said, "Grandma would have liked that." I said, "Yes, she would have." He said, "Violet, I owe you something." I said, "Yes, you owe the estate $8,000. That's what you owe." He said, "I meant something else." I said, "I know what you meant. What you owe the estate is the $8,000. What you owe me is between you and your conscience." He said, "That's not fair." I said, "Daniel, you sold a piano on the morning of your mother's funeral. Whatever I'm owed is less than the starting point of that conversation." He was quiet. He said, "I'm sorry. For what it's worth." I said, "It's worth something." I left. I want to tell you about the Saturday in March, 4 months after the funeral, when Marcus sent me a text that said, "Saturday at 3. She's ready." I drove to Hyde Park on a Saturday afternoon in March. Marcus's daughter, whose name is Lily, played the Chopin Nocturne in E-flat major on the Steinway upright model K52 with the yellowed ivory keys and the warm walnut case. She played it imperfectly, in the specific way of someone who has been studying a piece for 4 months and who has reached the stage where the music is inside her, but the fingers have not yet fully caught up to the music. There were hesitations and one place where she stopped and went back and the tempo was not consistent. It was the most beautiful thing I had heard in a very long time. I want to be specific about why. It was not beautiful because it was technically accomplished. It was beautiful because of what it represented, which was my grandmother's piano, producing the music that my grandmother had loved most from the hands of someone who had not yet been born when my grandmother first played that nocturne on those keys. Lily finished and looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has done something important and is waiting to know if the important person in the room thinks they did it right. I said, "That was exactly right." She said, "I missed the E in the second section." I said, "Yes. The E in the second section is the specific, difficult one." She said, "My teacher says if you can play the E right in the second section, the whole piece opens up." I said, "Your teacher is right about that too." She said, "Did your grandmother play it right?" I thought about 72 years of my grandmother at that piano, The specific way her hands had moved across those keys, the particular quality of how she had played the nocturne in the evenings when I had stayed late at Birch Street as a child, the lamp lit in the parlor, and the rest of the house dark. I said, "She played it right in ways that took her 40 years to learn." Lily said, "I'm 12. I said, "You have time." She said, "Did you learn it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Will you play it?" I looked at the piano. The Steinway upright that had been in my grandmother's front parlor since 1952, the yellowed ivory keys, the warm walnut case, the specific sound of a well-maintained Steinway that has been played for 72 years by someone who knew what she was doing. I sat down at the bench. I played the Chopin Nocturne in E-flat major on my grandmother's piano in Marcus Webb's living room in Hyde Park on a Saturday afternoon in March, and I played it the way my grandmother had taught me to play it, which was the way Elena Markova had taught my grandmother to play it, which was the way the music itself demands to be played, which is with complete attention to what it is actually saying rather than to how the playing looks or sounds or is received. When I finished, Lily was very still. She said, "You played the E right." I said, "Your teacher is right. The whole piece opens up." She said, "Will you teach me how you did it?" I sat at the bench for a moment, on the piano that had been in my family since 1952, in the specific March afternoon light coming through a window that was not the front parlor window of a Victorian house on Birch Street in Cincinnati, but that was the right light for the nocturne regardless. I said, "Yes, I'll teach you how." Here is what a dust outline on a hardwood floor and a note inside a piano lid taught me. I know that the things people love most are sometimes not protected in the formal ways that formal protection requires, and that the absence of formal protection does not make the love less real or the wishes less true. My grandmother did not put the piano in the will. She put the note in the piano. These are not equivalent forms of protection, and the note was not sufficient to do what the will could have done. She knew this, I believe, and she chose the note anyway, because the note was what she was able to do, and she trusted that it would be enough when it needed to be enough. She was mostly right. I know that the person sitting in the third row is sometimes the specific person the situation required to be sitting in the third row, and that their being there is not coincidence in the way that coincidence is usually dismissed, but is instead the specific result of a relationship that had been built over 42 years, producing the person who could confirm the specific fact that needed confirming in the specific moment it needed to be confirmed. I know that what I chose in Marcus Webb's living room, the specific choice to let the piano stay and ask for the 3 things I asked for instead of pursuing the legal resolution, was not a sacrifice in any dramatic sense. It was the specific expression of what I understood my grandmother's note to actually be asking for, which was not the piano's return to any particular person, but the piano's continuation with someone who would care for it, the way it deserved to be cared for. I have been back to Hyde Park 4 times since the Saturday in March. Lily Webb plays the Chopin Nocturne with more fluency each time. She is 14 months into learning on the Steinway upright that my grandmother bought used from a closing music school in 1952. She has learned the E in the second section. The piano teaches her things. This is what pianos do, the good ones, the ones that have been played for decades by people who knew what they were doing. They teach through the specific quality of their sound, and through the history that sound carries, and through the particular way that sitting at a well-made instrument that has been well-maintained changes what is possible in the music. She calls it the Baldwin. My grandmother would have found this exactly right. That is my story. A dust outline on a parlor floor. A note in an envelope taped inside a piano lid. A woman in the third row who knew what the note said before I found it. And a Saturday in March when I played the Chopin Nocturne for a 14-year-old girl who is going to be playing it for the rest of her life. If this reminded you of something that someone you loved wanted you to have that you chose to give forward to the right person instead, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that honoring what someone loved sometimes means releasing your claim to it rather than holding on. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.